Hi, and welcome everybody. This is a seminar in the Attire seminar series hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And I'm Ralph Borland. I'm joined here by many of my colleagues and other participants. And we're very excited today to welcome Chenai Chair, who is the Special Advisor on African Innovation at the Mozilla Foundation. And we're really looking forward to Chenai's contribution to part of our work at HUMA, which is looking at AI in Africa, in which we are aiming to critically investigate artificial intelligence on the continent, particularly in our strand of research funded by the Carnegie Corporation into healthcare. Chenai is presenting some of her work on a research project, My Data Rights, which is a feminist review of AI, privacy, and data protection to enhance digital rights. And Chenai is a graduate of UCT herself. We were just chatting earlier about her time at UCT and in Cape Town. Though Chenai is now based in Johannesburg, where she's joining us from. And so Chenai, as I mentioned, Special Advisor on African Innovation, and she works on projects such as the Common Voice African Languages Fellows and awardees, and she's an expert on the intersection of digital technology and gender. And we are particularly interested in her feminist lens on data and AI. And I was interested to read in her report from her study about some of the perspectives that a feminist approach brings that can be widely applied to other areas as well. So, Chenai, welcome. I'll hand over to you. So the first half of the hour is over to you for your presentation, and then we'll have discussion with participants. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It's pretty exciting to be in this space, to sort of like coming back to UCT. And I will start sharing my screen so that we can kick off the conversation. Just bear with me. Okay.
Looking good.
Great. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining the call and for listening to what I have to say about thinking about a datafied society from a feminist perspective. And so that's generally thinking about feminist digital praxis in terms of actually putting what we call feminist theory and ways of knowing into practice in the way that we understand data and society. So I guess the big question would be, why a feminist digital praxis when there's so many ways to actually really understand social injustice issues and also really fight for inequality in society? But I guess for me, it's because that this is, although there are many ways to skin a cat, this is one of the ways that I've always preferred in terms of understanding knowledge, because one, it's been something that's helped to really unpack society as it stands from a perspective of power, context, and also marginalization specific to women and gender diverse groups, as well as vulnerable groups based on like disability, for example. So for me, this is one of the things where taking on a feminist praxis is really not just about looking at society, but figuring out the points of transformation and moving beyond just being gender sensitive. And I opened up the slide with two quotes from my favorite African feminists who work on the digital space. But what they're basically arguing for is, one, the feminist lens to think about how we can transform society, and two, a call on actually getting more feminists into the space to take into account the issues that we have. This is why I'm pretty excited to be in the space that's interdisciplinary, because most of the time when we talk about digital technology, humanities are left out. And when we leave out the humanities aspect, we then have technologies that are likely to amplify already existing social injustices. So the first point, right, when taking a feminist perspective is always centering the context we're not viewing something from a God's eye perspective of like, we know it all and it's the other subject and that's in existence, but we're actually trying to locate what we're trying to understand within a particular context. And for me, when I was looking at this topic around AI, privacy and data protection, AI and privacy and data protection were not my starting points, which is what's often found in studies of technology, but actually gender inequality. And so then placing it in a context of South Africa, one of the things that's always underlying any innovation, any policy solution, anything that we have to think about is really the fact that we exist in a context of a triple threat of high inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And this mostly adversely affects women and gender diverse people and other vulnerable groups. So then what you then realize is that anything that's being developed, anything that's going to be put forward in terms of technology, as well as the use of data, these are actually in context of inequality, poverty, and unemployment that greatly impact a specific group. And I think even just to drill it down further, we know that there is a huge income gap in terms of inequality, with the labor market more favorable to men than women. And this recent quarterly labor force survey done by Stats SA for 2021 actually showed that this is more so for Black women, with 41% in the second quarter of 2021 actually having the highest rate of unemployment when compared to white women, when compared to Indian and Asian women, and when compared to colored women. So we already see those racial dynamics in play when it comes to actually just having access to finance that does allow for one to be able to operate on digital platforms fully. And then in addition to that, we know this is a context we exist in. Every other day, every other week, we're hearing of gender-based violence cases, right? Where we're hearing of women being murdered by their intimate partners, right? So people that they're familiar with. So then oftentimes this actually has an adverse effect on women, girls, and non-gender conforming individuals. So you find that these existent injustices that marginalized groups face and sexual minorities face actually also shape how they experience technology, policy, and regulation. So it's shaped in a way, their policies are often designed in a way to actually either address social justice issues, or the implementation of the technology can actually increase inequalities and harms. So again, this is then to acknowledge that there's a diversity even in this group, and the way that we experience technology and policies in place is often from that marginalized perspective. So having framed the gender inequality aspect, I think for me, what was important, or what I did in this research, was trying to figure out like, what is the AI discourse in this country? And at that time, this was 2020, 2021, 2019, 2020. A lot of the things that I found were more so questions of like, what can AI do to give business and government the cutting edge? So really thinking about AI from a perspective of, can we grow economies, the capabilities aspect? Can we increase production when we have artificial intelligence into our systems? And also, can we think about reducing labor costs? And then also there was a question of, can AI address societal and development problems? So this was linked to employment, which led to the thinking around upskilling. And then also the research needed to develop AI solutions. We've seen quite a number of AI research centers that have come up funded by the government or private sector with the aim of actually developing solutions around artificial intelligence, and really thinking about the skills, which I've already mentioned. And also lastly, the governance models in terms of this new technology, because it's data, so it definitely needs that data protection and privacy laws in place, but at the same time, really thinking about a governance that does allow for these technologies to actually rightly so be taken up into the sector. So overall, what we found was that mainly in this research, the conversations around AI are really driven by the private sector and then public sector from a government perspective. And so it's more responsive to business needs than it is to societal needs. And when it's designed for societal needs, it's in line with what's considered more so like a market approach or a neoliberal approach. And so I think of then the one thing of having, now you've got like this picture of there's gender inequality, and the second picture of there's technological determinism happening, where it's kind of like we have to make sure that everyone is on pace with technology. This is the part where then a feminist praxis really was what I found very powerful in order to actually unpack the impact of artificial intelligence when it comes to privacy and data protection for marginalized groups from a gender perspective. So my research was trying to really figure out like what would a gender responsive data protection and privacy law entail, and also really thinking about how can civil society play a role in ensuring transformative law and practice. So civil society for me has always been that one stakeholder in the ecosystem that can push change, like that is connected to the grassroots and is connected to policymakers and is able to take in knowledge and translate it in a way that would lead to supporting more groups to be able to vocalize any issues around marginalizations that they have. And then as a framework, I think it's quite interesting now, almost a year later, reflecting on it. The biggest struggle for me was there wasn't as much written from an African perspective when it came to trying to understand artificial intelligence from a feminist perspective. So all of the research and all like the framework had to be borrowed from work that had already been done in the global south, and really trying to build something that could touch on the multiple issues that I was trying to cover. So data feminism, the book that was written by Catherine Dinazio and Lauren Klein, which is actually publicly available, became the pillar for my work for providing principles that could guide the way that I was thinking about. Principles around examining power, challenging power, rethinking binaries, embracing pluralism, making labor visible in the work and the production, actually elevating emotion so that it's not just this disconnected research because it's data and a society, but also really thinking of embodiment of value of multiple forms of knowledge, right? Because most of the time when you think about the context around data, there is this focus on the numbers. And I think this is just generally in research around tech, like percentage change if we introduce kind of thing. But then what about the stories around the way that people experience the technology and how it does shape their day-to-day lives? And then I also took on the work of the feminist principles of the internet. So this is an ongoing body of work that was created collaboratively by feminists from the global south, really thinking about like, what is it that we have when we're thinking of a feminist internet, what is it that we want to see? And I really specifically focused on their principle around the right to privacy, which falls under the cluster of agency, the right to privacy and control over personal data and information online. Because I think in that there is a recognition that surveillance which is part of all of these datafied societies, has been a tool used by patriarchy to surveil non-conforming bodies and women to keep them in a particular line of thinking. And so then extending this context into the data space means that we're trying to argue for a system where people have agency over what it is that they're doing online. And then really thinking about intersectionality. So for intersectionality, the key writers for me will always be Kimberly Crenshaw, who penned the work, and then also Dr. Sylvia Tamale, who in a recent book on digital decolonizing the space and focused on Afrofeminist futures. And she also unpacks what intersectionality would mean from an African context, taking into account colonialism, taking into account classism, taking into account the racial dynamics, and then also providing that experience of inequality for women. And then lastly, a data justice approach. So not lastly, but data justice approach that was initially penned by, that's been borrowing from the work that was done by Dr. Lynette Taylor, or part of the Global Data Justice Network, and really thinking about how it allows for us to acknowledge the complexity of new technology systems and how they can be used to discriminate, discipline, and control, but also take into account the positive and the negative potential of these new technologies. So framing that complexity from a data justice perspective, while really thinking about centering marginalized groups in this conversation. And then lastly, feminist ethics. So feminist ethics, really thinking about applying care to the work that I was doing, being reflective and recognizing what my positionality was in this kind of work, but also really just thinking about acknowledging the different ways of knowledge and taking into account the risk that is involved in participating in this kind of work. So you can see that it was literally a framework where it had to take different areas of thought that could be applied. And I think, just to put it out there, because we're in this space, it would be great to see how further research can build up on one particular aspect of this in order to build up more knowledge from an African feminist perspective. So then moving on, I guess, having set up the scene in terms of like the context and the framework of thinking, the thing for me was then really, we live in a context when it comes to the digital space, there is this increased policy and intervention perspective that focuses on increasing access and closing the gender digital divide, which basically means in the African context, there are more men who are more likely to be, men are more likely to be online than women. So that we have a strong gender digital gap. But then in thinking about access in a datafied society, we have to recognize that with gender stereotypes that we exist with in our cultural and social norms, comes problems of privacy, innovation, and abrogation. So the term of uneasy access, which was coined by Anita Allen when she was looking at the work around privacy, highlights the way in which access to the internet may be problematic for women and gender diverse people as the continuation of existing power dynamics and control from offline realities play out in this space, right? So then there's this call of everybody should get on the internet, but when we're online, there is this realization that there is still a control and an expectation based on gender stereotypes. So as part of my work, one of the things that then started doing was really trying to map what were the concerns around AI from a gender perspective in general. And these were issues as connected to the work, the framework that I've already done, the lack of agency and control over data. So then this is the part where we see that, you know, people are often like, I don't know what's going on my system, but I just have to accept so that I can participate in the space. Thinking about consent in the context of unequal power dynamics. In my work, I talk about the social grants case, where people had, you know, that system in the end, which has now been dealt with, but basically someone having access to your data and then loaning you as according to that system and leaving you more indebted. But because this is a group of people who relied on having access to the grant system and had no choice but to give up their data, they really didn't have control over their consent. And then really thinking about data variance and privacy challenges, feeling like you're consistently being watched and people finding out the information that you have, and also really wondering if you can really have an extent of privacy online because of the issues at hand. And then lastly, discrimination and bias at the intersection of race, class, and gender. So then having that experience of, you know, if you, I think there's one case that I documented of a woman who was a developer, a woman of color, who went to the bank here in South Africa, asked for a loan and couldn't get it. And she actually put two and two together and realized it was more so because of the data that was being used to determine whether she could have access to the loan, and she was flagged as a risk. So this is the reality of navigating AI-based systems such as automated decision-making that would then have an impact on one's gender. And I think for me, so this is found in my work, but just to put this in more context, one of the biggest challenges was really not finding as much evidence around the experiences of women and gender diverse people when it comes to artificial intelligence-based systems on the continent and in South Africa specifically. So most of the examples really came from having done work that's been mapped from Europe and North America. And this is actually something that has been a significant challenge in my work. But over the in this last year, I know a lot of people have been working towards documenting more so the experience of gender and AI on the African continent. And so I think it's difficult to argue in any context that there is this concern about AI without having to really ask people who work with marginalized groups and who also live through this experience. So in order to fill that gap of not having information that is local, and that, like a wide range of information that is local, what I then did was conduct a survey and interviews with people. The survey was an open-ended survey that was done with activists who work with women and gender diverse groups, just to really, and then provide them with examples, with scenarios that were curated from this research, and ask them to reflect on their perspective in terms of like, what would it feel like if this was to happen within a South African context. So this is just a summary of the key points that emerged around the perceived harms and concerns, which are really around like having access, who has access to my data and how is it being stored, thinking about exclusionary automated decision making. And again, this was really highlighted in the finance sector, where it's more so you see yourself being rejected to have access to something, and you really begin to realize it's about your race and your gender. And also really concerns around surveillance, especially by the fact that crime is mainly associated with Black people. So if you're thinking about going into an affluent area with CCTV cameras that are being used for security purposes, am I not going to be flagged because of my identity in this space? And then just that lack of knowledge of where does the information go? And then also really thinking about profiling. So having access to ad spaces, and then you search for particular information, the next thing you know, it's coming up on every other page. And I think this concern was also raised when it comes to queer people, in terms of like, if you share a device and you search for queer related information, and you haven't come out to your family, this information will now be available on their platform. And then also privacy breaches. Like, this was really connected to online gender-based violence, where one of our participants of the survey actually said that privacy breach can make one susceptible to non-consensual intimate image sharing. And I think with the age of deep fakes through AI that are then used to superimpose people in pornographic content, this is actually a further concern of like, when someone has my image, what is it that they'll do with it? So I guess a review for focus was just really that this work was really trying to understand social injustices and digital rights specific to privacy and data protection. And privacy and data protection has, on the African continent, has steadily progressed over the last decade, with laws developing at various levels at national and sub-regional level. So for my work, I've specifically focused on the Protection of Personal Information Act of 2013, which actually came into effect last year. Again, a summary of some of the issues that emerged from thinking around the Protection of Personal Information Act. One thing I want to say is that a lot of the principles and the guidances around the POPI Act are actually quite progressive in terms of thinking about some of the protections that they have in place, and having an information regulator that people can turn to. And also, just generally compared to the African region, we are doing quite well as a country. But then when it comes specifically to gender, there are actual limitations that a feminist reading allows for one to pick up. So really thinking about gender as a category of harm is not really engaged within the document. What's really spoken about is sexual orientation and sex life, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a need for the law to really think about the different sensitivities and harms associated for intersex people, transgender, and diverse communities. And then the language in the law is more so he, she, which is actually gender exclusionary. And it's quite important for it to move beyond he, she to they. And we've seen this in the Cyber Crimes Act, where they actually make use of inclusionary language. And the law itself has also been criticized as being more responsive to a global context. And without a doubt, this is something that we can all map to see where the influences on data protection laws have come from. If you're in Southern African region or English-speaking region, it's really related to the initial European data protection work, and then the general data protection regulation that's currently in place right now. And also generally the influence of policy writing and policy spaces that saw all of this policy generation being done in a way that would allow for that global exchange of knowledge and global trade based on matching frameworks. So there is a need for this to be more responsive. And one of the respondents in the survey actually pointed out that the law was more Eurocentric in thinking about individualism and protection of rights, yet there was a need to engage with the reality of community-based harms, which is more so the experience when it comes to from a gender perspective. And then also really thinking about capacity and awareness to engage, right? So this is like a grace, because of course the law was only came into full effect with the exception of 2 clauses last year. So then there is a need for more capacity building and awareness for the public to be able to engage, to really think about, can I use particular aspects of this current law to address any issues that I face? And then also, we have seen civil society actually making use of this law to challenge specific cases. Say, for example, the Vumatel CCTV license system that was being launched in a neighborhood in Johannesburg, if I'm not mistaken. But there isn't a gender nuance that we've seen from the civil society response when thinking about surveillance and privacy in South Africa. And that's something that's really quite important if we're going to think of civil society being able to respond to the issues at play. Yep, so as I work towards finishing the section, I guess the key thing is really a feminist practice allows for like a more gender responsive lens in the design and implementation of policies that would consider the gendered realities of the society we live in, and ensure that injustices are not replicated as we work towards digital development. So for me, this is one of the particular strong points of why a feminist practice is important, because at the end of the day, it's really half of the population that's really affected if we're thinking about women only. And then we think about the diversity in terms of gender and sexuality. And then we realize that we don't want to end up making systems that work for a gendered minority. So some of the recommendations that I put forward is really thinking about policy and regulation. So engaging with policymakers to think about what would be the gender issues that need to be addressed. Having the knowledge around like creating spaces and forums that would see marginalized groups actually raising the points that they have. And research and documentation to actually academia and civil society in terms of activists working together to document the cases of harms experienced, but to also keep track of any innovations that are put into place and reflect on how they could affect society, especially thinking about the context of smart cities. And then raising public awareness, because at the end of the day, we could all be having this conversation and be aware of the issues at hand, but you only need to go on Twitter or Facebook to just realize that people feel powerless and really think that they don't have any position for change. And then lastly, engaging with the technical community. So thinking about their responsibility. Oftentimes I find that conversations focus on Facebook and Google, like the big tech companies, but the reality is we also have startups and tech entrepreneurs within our own particular context. And there's a need to engage with them in thinking of how they're developing technologies that would then be more responsive to societal issues at play, rather than increasing social inequalities because of a need to make sure that they are market ready and people can take up the process. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation, and these are my contact details. I'll stop sharing the screen and open up for conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Chenai. That was great. And yeah, we will open up for discussion, and I'm sure my colleagues have plenty of comments and questions. I just wanted to draw attention to one aspect of your work that that strikes me, is that using a feminist approach to analyzing data rights and AI isn't only restricted to revealing gender bias. It's involved in uncovering much wider implications around power. And I sort of picked out the things that you were listing around making labor visible, for example. And in your My Data Rights document, there's a little list of the 7 guiding principles of data feminism, which are examine power, challenge power, elevate emotion and embodiment, rethink binaries, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And I think it's just a great reflection of how these perspectives apply more widely and would help to liberate society more widely, as well as having particular application to gender and to feminist concerns. Yeah, great. So who amongst my colleagues or would like to ask a question? I see Amina has her hand up. So Amina, would you like to ask a question? And if you'd like to turn your video on, yes, there you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you, Chenai, for this wonderful session, and also for the documents that I've read and that I'll be reading for the next months as well. I think it's really great to be able to move from theory to praxis, and I think you've done that really great, because yeah, when I feel like in academia we tend to not be stuck in theory, but yeah, something along those lines. But I had a question around what you've said on civil society, and I think from what I've experienced here in Morocco and from what I've seen with civil society and technology and AI, there's a lot of funding coming in from the private sector. And I think with that comes a different set of, a different agenda that is not necessarily regulated by the government. And I just wanted to hear a little bit around on your thinking on that point. What happens when civil society is funded by the private sector, and how do we maneuver around it, and how do we investigate that?
So I just want to understand for context, is civil society being funded by the private sector to lobby for their work or to engage on issues at hand? Before I respond.
More like funding civil society to generate or put in place technologies to eradicate social inequalities, but it's kind of a blurred process. We don't understand it fully.
Yeah, so I think that's like a common issue, especially when you think about like the digital rights landscape. Most of the funding, so I'll layer it in terms of thinking about the system. The system of funding is really, it's either you're going to get funding from private sector or you're going to get funding from international governmental organizations or the nonprofit space or foundations like Mozilla, for example. And what I found is that what's really growing in the digital rights space, a lot of the easier funding that allows for development of such systems in civil society is coming from the private sector, because it isn't as I wouldn't say doesn't have as many strings attached to it, but it's not as intense to get a grant from the private sector than it is from existing institutions such as IDRC. So placing in that context, and it could be different from Morocco, but this is my understanding around like funding of the civil society space. Then in terms of thinking about the blurred lines, one of the biggest things that I found is that there's a need to really think about the extent to which there's transparency around the funding dynamic that's in place, especially if it's coming from the private sector. I exist in space, like most of the digital rights conferences and events have had funding from like Facebook and Google, especially like if you think about the one that just recently ended, Forum on Freedom Online in Africa. And so then you really think about the extent to which there's transparency and control over the content and issues that are being done. And then also the power dynamics existent in that space. So if there's funding that's being given from like a private company, to what extent has civil society been able to set the terms and conditions necessary to ensure that if they are going to address social justice issues, they do it in a way that works for them? And we've seen that this is something that has always happened before in the digital rights space, where people would get proprietary funding for like laptops. And then the software that would be applied would be connected to a particular company, such as Microsoft, and then you wouldn't be able to use anything else. So I think that there's a need to always unpack the extent to which the existing power dynamics allow for the people who are receiving the grant to actually set the tone of engagement, but also really thinking about more so working in terms of like collaboratively of civil society, thinking about what would be the mechanisms for transparency and accountability that would allow for another institution that's working in the same space to hold another institution accountable. So then at the end of the day, if you think about when Facebook's free basics was introduced, right? That was really such a complicated case, not because in one instance you had civil society that was based in like India and Brazil, Latin America, really arguing that free basics shouldn't even exist at all. It shouldn't be taken into like poorer countries. And then you had civil society on the African continent and research being done that the reality is a lot of people are not even taking up free basics, and the people who use it are using it because the issue at hand is around the cost of the internet. So then the question there was more so, how do you strike the balance in order to ensure that social justice is actually achieved and we're actually able to hold these companies accountable and place it in a context of realization that the bigger picture is we need to address the issue of existent inequality, and this is the way that can be done. So I hope I responded to actually say that it's complex and there's a lot of things that need to be done to hold people accountable.
Thank you. Thank you, Chenai and Amina. I'm also reminded of the conversation with a recent attire guest, Nanjala Nyabola, who was also talking about being a digital citizen and the tension that exists in the idea of being a citizen of a somewhat civic space that's actually privately, it's composed mainly of private profit-making companies. So you have this tension around what is this space. And I think particularly valuable having you here from the Mozilla Foundation, because to my mind, the Mozilla Foundation represents another ethos for the internet, which is to defend it as not to do with the making of profit or of a business space, but as of something like a civic space. So that's a very present tension in today's vision of the internet. So my colleague Wangui, who's in Kenya, is going to ask a question or make a comment. Wangui, please go ahead. And I know that Wangui can't turn her video on at the moment, so she's just going to ask with her voice. Okay.
Thanks, Ralph, and thanks, Chenai. I really appreciate your presentation, because I have a job in AI, but I feel like I'm Huma's resident dinosaur because I don't know anything about AI. So I really learned a lot from your presentation. My question has to do with your reference to what you termed technological determinism. And I just wanted to hear from you what you meant by that, because I think we can interpret it in different ways. In one sense, I was thinking that means, dinosaurs like myself were resisting technology, but I think you offer much more nuance. So I'd love to hear what you meant by technological determinism.
So I'm sorry, I'm just laughing at the term dinosaur because sometimes I do feel like one myself. So when I was talking about technological determinism, I was really thinking more so about the jump onto tech will save us, right? Like really thinking about it as a silver bullet in society, and all we need to do is to hop onto the next trend of technology. Once we have this in place, we'll do better. So that's how I've always framed tech determinism, and really thinking about it as it being pushed by evangelical preachers, who are kind of like, all we need to do is make sure that all the women have like cell phones, and then they won't they'll feel safer. So that's how I've thought about technological determinism.
Thanks very much, Chenai, and thanks, Wangui, for that question. It's actually something that I also picked out and was glad that you raised about technological determinism, because I think it's really important to our work here is the idea of technology choice as a counter to determinism. So rather than the idea that technology is this somehow self-motivating force that we have to follow behind and, adopt, that we might have some, social, political reasons for choosing whether to adopt new technologies or not, or how far. So that's important to challenge the idea of determinism. Great. Do we have any other questions or comments from colleagues or other participants? You're welcome to raise your little yellow hand if you'd like to hear. So Divine is writing in the chat window. This is perhaps a rhetorical question, but in the era of everything must fall and decolonization, do we need the internet to emancipate ourselves? How do you respond to that, Chenai?
I think it's part of the tool bag, right? Like at the end of the day, one of the things that as in like feminist movements, we always say, yes, you are online on the present space, but do figure out ways to still connect into the offline space. And also realizing that it's a continuum of offline and online. So how we exist offline also plays out in how we exist online. So I can't say that we necessarily need it as the only solution, but it's part of the toolkit because of the realization that a lot of people are able to connect in a way that, if they were in physical spaces, they would never have done this. Like I would never have able to respond to Nguyi's question unless if I was in the same physical space as Nguyi. And so I think what we've been thinking about at Mozilla Foundation and a lot of other people is thinking about the alternative to the current models of the internet, the way that it exists. Really thinking about different business models when it comes to social media platforms, for example, or the way in which it's more so advertisement driven. And really thinking about how do you take the infrastructure to develop new ecosystems that could lead to that kind of emancipation that we would want to see. So at the end of the day, it's really kind of really thinking of, I think for me, I'll frame it as the question of, with the way the internet currently exists, do we need it? And I think the response is that we don't. We actually need to rebuild and think of other alternatives that can see us actually being able to design a space that will be more inclusionary, to design a space that's more self-aware and a space that actually, thinks about care in the way that it actually operates in the online space. So I can see there's a further part to the question. Yeah, so I don't think that the internet allows to violate without consequences and to censor without accountability. I think this is something that's already existent in context, right? If we think about society at large, the laws that we have in place and the practice that we have in place, they benefit some and marginalize others. So oftentimes what the internet is actually doing is replicating that existence of the people who can get away with particular things and the people who actually are not actually the ones who actually, get the justice that they need. And one key example is, which for me is always stuck, is the way in which women and gender diverse people experience online violence and online harassment. And only when Trump, the former president of the United States, had that experience where he had COVID and people were wishing death on him, did then Twitter say, oops, sorry, we can't wish death on someone. But for years and years, women and activists online had experienced death threats, rape threats, and basically, getting information doxed on these platforms, and yet they couldn't get these platforms to respond. So it took someone at a more presidential level for them to respond. And then one actually realizes that, yeah, these spaces have been created, but they are reflective of the power dynamics that are already existent, which basically means that I, as a Black woman, when I enter onto the online space, my experience is going to be completely the harassment that I experience in the street when a car drives by and whistles at me and I panic is a sort of harassment that I would experience when I go onto the online platform where someone feels entitled to saying something about me. And so then that extension, because that protection is not existent in the physical world, that practice continues to also exist on the internet and the online platform as well.
Thank you very much, Chenai. Raising some very important and complex issues. I'm just thinking about that issue of visibility, the fact that, for example, discrimination or abuse of women in public spaces and physical spaces is sometimes not visible to people who aren't in that position. So if you walk down the street, you might experience a different street to if I walk down the street, and I might not see it. Whereas in the online space, I wonder if it's the same. Is it more visible or less visible? It's it offers a different environment for it.
Yes.
I'm also particularly, I think, interested in this. I loved your idea of the toolkit from which we can select, because there are so many varied potentials in the technology available to us. And Wikipedia is the one example that, it's a very striking example in the online space of, if it wasn't the particular individuals involved in Wikipedia, it would be a very different beast to what it is now. They've really defended Wikipedia to be what it is as a free, open kind of platform. So I'm going to look to the chat, and there's a question from Sarah Koshin. Thanks, Chenai, for this interesting presentation. I was wondering if you faced any challenges when you were doing this study. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think one of the challenges that I faced initially when I was doing the study is just that people were not concerned about privacy and data protection in terms of thinking about like civil society, because that's where I wanted to have the most impact. And then when COVID happened and a lot of the new technologies were coming into place, such as the trackers that were being implemented, a lot of people then began to get concerned about privacy and data protection. So at least there was something that people could resonate with. So that was at that level. And I think another challenge that I faced was really talking about artificial intelligence when there were more pressing issues in the digital space in terms of thinking about access. So oftentimes the argument was, why do we need to look at AI when we really just need to think about focusing on access? So there was a need for me to draw the parallels between, existing in a datafied society and actually getting access and the concerns that would emerge. And then also really, because this was also one of those taking on a feminist praxis, really thinking about how would I make people visible and the ethics that were around that, because then I had to really think about like setting up consent in a way where people could choose to not be included in the project at any stage of the work, and also really communicating that so that people would know that this was part of the focus. And then lastly, another challenge that I faced was just really getting policymakers to see this as an issue. So I think most of the times policymakers are kind of like, all we need to do is put in a privacy and data protection law. We don't really necessarily need to have, why do we need this gender nuance? We already speak to these communities, and that's important. And I think that's continuous work that I have to do and others have to do, is really emphasizing why there is a gendered aspect to this work and why it needs to be taken into account. So those are some of the challenges that I faced throughout the work.
Thank you, Chenai. And I'm going to go to Azza, who has her hand up, a colleague at Huber. Azza, please go ahead.
Hi. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think I could resonate with a lot of things during my experience in terms of work experience of studies, where you have to somehow engage with different types of technologies. Especially when it comes to what you talked about, social media platforms, where women get really, or like, I mean, yeah, I mean, whoever is powerful in that space always undermines who is less powered. And yeah, the sort of bullying, you know, the violent talks or the violent comments that we see. And I mean, recently we see always this kind of things that pop up and hide comments that, okay, I'm hiding this AI is working in hiding this comment because this comment has a kind of you know, like sort of yeah, violent words, so it has to be hidden. Unless you want to see it, then you click on it and open it. And I find, I mean, it somehow shows that, okay, there is something done, but I don't think that's enough, you know, like the penalties of these things should go beyond that, not just, you know, like just hiding and everything. And I wonder, like in such kind of systems we have, because there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of cases I could sit and recite, but like how could we advocate to push things further, you know, like how could we have, I mean, I'm still grappling with that question, because there's a lot of cases where people just get away with whatever they say, whatever they do, you know, and it could be very harmful. It could be reached to the extent that people are blackmailed, you know, and people are really, yeah. So I don't know, in that kind of sense, how could we really, you know, make sure that people will be held accountable for such kind of, yeah, acts.
Thanks, Azza. I think you asked, is it okay, Ralph, if I take it? I think you've asked $1 million question. Because basically, how do we hold perpetrators of violence accountable? And we've already seen in our existing mechanisms way before social media that that's difficult, right? Like the law, the system itself is not sufficient to hold people accountable. And I think this is what we see playing out online. There have been instances where you know, like the Cybercrimes Act, for example, does allow for one to be able to get some form of persecution that is in place when something that happens, reports the incident, and actually makes it a criminal case, and you're able to, people get fined, or you know, they get taken into jail. Non-consensual intimate sharing, the biggest victory was actually getting that recognized in the Film and Publication Act, and seeing people getting sentenced and billed, and therefore, I do know that the hate crimes bill that's been set up has been set up as one of those conversations where we kind of are able to then say, how do we address and hold people accountable? But the biggest thing that I do know is that it's not just enough for law. There's a need for also for social media platforms to they argue that there's a need to balance between freedom of expression and content moderation. But then oftentimes what you then find is that the content that's moderated is more so the content that actually benefits the perpetrators. So in the example that you've just raised around the hidden comments, the people who often get, we call it shadow banning, or have this extent of like information controlled, are actually feminists and people who are calling out violence online. So what you find is that there's a skewedness in the way that the algorithm works that ends up flagging vulnerable groups who are actually trying to hold people accountable as the problematic ones. A lot of the times you find that feminist accounts are the ones that get locked out. I think it was quite interesting if you take it into context how the terms such as men are trash and where it came from in terms of violence against women. And then on the platforms such as Facebook, it's absolutely banned. There is no critical thinking about it. It is considered hate speech and no one engages with it. So then you see that in terms of thinking about accountability, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around like documentation of the issues at hand, then thinking about solutions that put more onus on social media platforms, because they have the control and they have all of the information and they can best determine which way to go. But the determination needs to be done in consultation with civil society and academia, because then we run the risk of over content moderation that then limits freedom of expression. And then we see, I think there's been documentation of how content moderation is prioritized is according to a market. And I think there was a whistleblower from Facebook who spoke about like there were priority countries where issues could be seen as happening that would result to like possible violence happening against a particular group, but they were not prioritized in terms of thinking about content moderation because they were not priority markets. And so then the accountability is really trying to hold the people with the information and the data to actually really pay equal attention to all of the interested stakeholders who are on the platforms. Instead of saying we've hired 20,000 content moderators, and then you find out those 15,000 are going to be moderating English, and then the 5,000 are for the rest of the world. You know, that's the ridiculousness of the way in which platforms are operating. And that is the space we need to hold accountable and shift that sort of engagement.
Thank you
Thanks very much,
yeah.
Chenai. Thanks, Azat. So we have only a few minutes left in the seminar, which has gone quickly, but I think let's just have, we have one more question that's in the chat, and we'll take that and close with it. But Amina, who spoke earlier, is asking, did you have to use a different language or tongue when doing this research, since perhaps a lot of these terms are not commonly used within the communities you've researched with?
No, so I didn't have to, but what I then did was then use the approach of like scenarios, because then the scenarios were something that was much more easy to translate. So instead of saying like, you know, like, look, this AI is just doing a surveillance, what we did then say is provide a scenario where, say, for example, when we were thinking about profiling, we provided a scenario of someone who would apply for a job at Amazon, and then the computer would pick up their CV, the computer would put two and two together and then determine that this is likely to be a woman from a particular background, therefore not befitting for this job, so then they wouldn't be used. So that's what we used, that's what I used in the research as a way to actually get people for people to connect to the issue, and for them to also then reflect like, okay, fine, if this experience was to happen to me, this is what it would look like. So I do know that there has been work, and I think because you spoke about Nanjala, she's been doing work on trying to localize some of these terms in Kiswahili. And then also through our own Common Voice project, we are trying to do work on building up open source data sets for voice technologies that then can allow for people to actually hear some of these things in their own languages in a way that understands them as well.
Thanks very much, Chenai. And we are coming to the close of this seminar, and we really value your participation here and spending some time with us. So thank you very much. Thanks for your contribution. Next week's attire seminar is Tapiwa Guja, and it's going to be a form of a critical cooking show in which Tapiwa takes us through food as a vehicle for culture and a decolonial approach to cooking. Yeah, we're always trying to push the boundaries here at the Attire Seminar Series around what constitutes academic work and intellectual inquiry and output. So thank you very much, Chenai. You've been very helpful to us, and thank you. I hope you tune into next week's show if you're interested in seeing what Tapiwa has to offer as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I suspect Tapiwa is a Zimbabwean, so I'm looking forward to actually like following up with my own country person as well.
Yes, yeah, you'll love some of his recipes. He runs Tapi Tapi ice cream in Cape Town, which is never tried it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, Ralph.
Yeah, that's really my pleasure, and the department. So yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks to my colleagues and my director. This has been a Humor Attire Seminar Series, and we're closing out. Thank you, everyone.